Good afternoon, everybody. This is Kris Scully coming to you live from Drive. And today I have a special guest, Kris Bullinger from Olympic Truck Service. Hi, Kris.
Hi, Kris. How's it going?
It's going great. How about you?
Good. We're just it's around lunchtime and just hanging around.
All right, great. So, we want to talk a little bit about managing change in your shop. And let's see, you've been a Drive client now for several years, right?
Almost 5 years, I think.
Yeah. And I remember like one of the first classes that I had with you, things were not in the condition they're in now. I'll say it that way.
They were not. No.
So I want to talk a little bit about that. Because one of the things that is really critical to succeeding with our program is you have to implement things and do things differently than you did them before. And first, what I want to know from you is how hard was it to get your wits around just that fact?
We basically, since we bought the shop a little over 5 years ago, have changed basically everything.
Right.
Our shop, like a dying business. Our shop was basically a dying business at that point. Our equipment was old. Our employees were not all like old age, but they were used to doing things on paper, slowly, like super inefficient, and not interested in any updates or changes. And things were dirty and just we had no idea of the amount of work that needed to be done to get things running like they should. Like there was no workflow. Everything was just like fly by the seat of your pants and hope that it works out.
Yeah, I totally get that. So you came in pretty soon after you bought the business, if I recall correctly.
Let's see. So Dan started working at the shop right away in 2018 when we bought the shop. I started at the beginning of 2020 working full-time at the shop. So about a year and a half in. And then I had come on working part-time the previous July, so July of 19. And that was right before we went digital. So went from all paper to all digital.
Yeah.
So.
All right. And now, when it came to, all right, let me ask you this question. When it came to advice from your coach to implement this or that, what was for you and Dan, what were the hardest things for you to actually implement?
So the hardest part we found in implementing anything, I'll just use like going digital as an example, because that was a gigantic step we had to take.
Yeah.
The first thing was deciding to actually do it. The second was, okay, like what software do we want to use? And then what does that look like implementation into our business, going from all paper to all digital? And there was going to be like, we had a bit of a lag, but there was really no, like once we turned on the switch, like we made the change, and like kind of consequences be damned. So it was very scary and very like we didn't know what was going to happen. Like we didn't have a plan. I mean, we kind of had a plan, we knew that was what it's going to be, and it was going to be better at some point, but there was no time on it. Like we knew, okay, we were gonna like November 1st. So we started September 1st. We were going to give it 60 days where we ran both like the paper and digital simultaneously. And then we were turning like we were going full digital, and we ended up doing it a little bit early. We ended up doing it around October 15th because it was just too hard to run them both. And people were like, well, we like to do it this way, so we're just not gonna make the change. Like, that's not an option. We're not doing that. So it was very stressful and very, not choppy, but like just like there was not really a plan. I mean, there kind of was, but it was very loose, very loose.
Right. And that, you brought up so many important points that I think are what prevent people from making major changes in their business, which is that there's a lot that goes into it. And first of all, it's getting your own head around it. And am I making the right decision? And do I have a good plan? And then there's the employees who don't really want to change anything at all. If you leave them to their own devices, they would keep doing the same thing forever.
Yes.
Even if it's not the best thing, because, let's face it, people generally are hesitant to change things because they like to do what's familiar. And even if the change is beneficial, they object not to what you're changing, but to the fact that you're changing something.
Right. It's easier just to keep doing what you're doing, whether it works well or not, just status quo is the way to go. So.
Right. So for our audience, I'm going to just quickly describe our managing change workshop, which you've now done after you did that conversion to digital. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So the managing change workshop is about how would you do something like what Kris just described in a way where you have a lot more certainty, that it goes smoother, you're not quite so anxious and nervous about it, and you can be confident when you get to the point of implementing that change that you're on the right track and you're doing the right thing. And after a lot of research, we came up with a system of change management that's called drivers, which is an acronym. And we're going to get into what it means in a little bit as we talk about it. But that system, if you follow it, allows you to successfully and more smoothly, I'll say, as sometimes things go wrong even with the best of plans, manage change in your shop. Okay, that's what the workshop's about. Now, Kris, you've done the workshop, and we talked a little bit yesterday about some of the things that you got out of it. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, actually, let's just go through some of the steps of the system and how you did it and how you might have done it if you did it today. Okay. So for everybody, the driver system is an acronym, and it stands for diagnosis, revisions, implementation, verification, empowerment, ROI, and share. DRIVERS. All right. Now, you mentioned some things that you did that were definitely part of the diagnosis step. You knew you had to make the change. You knew what you wanted to change. You researched some of the different DVI systems that you could have used. You decided on one. And when you decided that, let me ask you this. Were you certain that you'd made the right choice?
Yes.
Okay, good.
So yeah, Dan and I had looked into it a lot, and he had full bay in mind when we switched. And so we actually, our very first Drive Expo, we went around and we talked to all of like the vendors that had different software to use, and we had full bay in mind. So we talked to them quite a bit, and were able to then, see, like, get a live thing, talk to the specialists that were there. And it was a really cool opportunity to get to talk to them, and like all of the different vendors, of course, but having someone there from full bay to answer questions and show us kind of how to use everything was really helpful.
Great. So for everybody, that's what the diagnosis step is all about, is you look at something that you want to improve in your shop, and you look at it from every angle, and you're sure when you get through that step that it is a change that you want to make, and that you're certain that's something that you're going to work on and implement. So the next step is revisions, which is something that like when we talked earlier, that was one thing that, the having a plan part, right? And you mentioned that you kind of had a plan when you went digital, but not really.
Mm-hmm.
So knowing what you know now, how would that step have been different?
I think that would have been the biggest change that we would have made, would be in the revisions area of drivers. We, like, when you go from like only paper to digital, it's a big, like, we didn't have a good idea of what we wanted. We knew that we wanted things to change, but we weren't exactly sure what those were, if that makes sense. So like
Yeah,
our
totally.
workflow was like non-existent. So we knew we wanted a workflow, but like we didn't really know what that meant. I mean, I guess. So, like starting out, like you want to write up an SO, or an RO, and then, but then what?
Right.
It used to be on paper, and then it had a paper jacket, and it went in a certain place. So like, what did that look like in the computer? Like, okay, we wrote up the RO and we had the steps in there, but then like, how do you get that to a tech, or how do we want to get that to the tech? Like, we know how Full Bay can do it, but like, what do we want that to look like? And so I think
Mhm.
that's like what we wanted was the big, like, what Full Bay could do and what we were currently doing and what we actually wanted to do. I think that those were all like three separate things in the process.
Yeah.
And so we were revising what we were wanting to do faster than we were actually like knowing what to do. Like, we're like, okay, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? And then we would call Full Bay, and they're like, oh yeah, we can absolutely do that. And then we're like, well, what about this? And they're like, well, yeah, we can do that too. Is that what you want? And we're like, well, we don't actually know what we want. Like, I think so. Like, so we would like try something out and be like, okay, well, like part of that works, but like this part doesn't work. Because at that point we were running day shift and night shift. And so it was really, the communication piece was really difficult from, the 3:30 like shift change, and then over
Yeah.
the weekend where they left at midnight, and then at 7 a.m. on Monday morning people were coming in. And so that was, I think, our biggest thing. I think that we probably revised that for like a year, like just over and over, making like big changes and then smaller changes until we finally figured out, okay, this is what we want. And then like, how do we get there? Like, what do we need
Right.
to train our employees? And then like, how do we even do that? Like, so that, like, that constant revision was where we were missing big pieces. So
Right. Yeah. And that's a great example of, I hate to say it, but what not to do.
no, it totally was. Like, in
And
hindsight, it was a disaster, and I would have done it
yeah,
completely different. Like, it worked out in the end. Things always
sure.
do, things
Yeah.
always work out, but I feel like it could have been quicker and less painful had
Right.
we had some just sort of like framework to plug the situation into, to know like, okay, revisions are okay, but you kind of need to, like, you need to know where you want to go before you
Right.
start the journey. Like,
No, that's
know.
exactly the point. And I think that too often in business, you get an idea, hey, I think we should do blah. And you start doing it without thinking it all through and without knowing exactly what you're looking for as a result of that particular change. And then then it's hard to know if you even got there.
Right.
And it becomes even worse if, like, and I've been through this myself, where you start down that road and you kind of have an idea where you want to get to, and then you even change that. Well, you don't want to get to there. We want to get way over there somewhere. And then you're taking some left turn in the middle of implementation, which is also can create a lot of chaos.
Right.
And that's a really important point for everybody, is that one of the real advantages of the driver's systems is that it breaks it down so that you know when you're ready to implement. And if you follow the system, then, and you get to that point where you absolutely know you're ready to implement, then implementation becomes so much easier. And now I want to ask you about something you mentioned a minute ago, which was training.
Mm-hmm.
So when you started down that road of going digital, did you have an idea or an estimation of how much training would be involved to get to the other side?
We had no idea. Like, we didn't know what we were doing. Oh my goodness. It got to the point where things were so bad, like with the paper, that we were just like, we're just gonna do this and like see what happens at that point. Like, we weren't sure where we were going, and like you just knew we wanted to get started. And if we didn't just do it, like, it probably would never happen. So we Full Bay provided training for our techs and for our service advisors. At that point, we had one person like writing service, and they were the shop foreman. It's a lot different now, but that person was kind of like the main cog in everything at Olympic Truck Service. And so Dan went through training, and Kevin is his name, went through training, and then some of our techs. And so there were more questions than there were answers at any point in time. Like, I didn't even go through the original training because I didn't work at the shop yet. I had my other job still.
Mm-hmm.
And so Dan trained me, but nothing was written down, like, outside of what Full Bay provided. And they did a really good job. And then they have really good videos of how to do things. And so it was all really helpful. But then we had our parts person, we have a parts guy who went through training, but he thought it was stupid. And he was like, oh, well, I'll do this part, but I'm not going to do this part. And I'm like, it's not optional. Like, this is happening. So like, apparently it wasn't clear that that's what, it just was very, we'll call it squishy. It was like, there was no firm plan. Like,
right.
We winged it.
Yeah, totally get it. All right. Well, you got through it.
We did.
And it's all in place and it's working now. And ultimately it turned out, like you said, it turned out all right. And I think that's kind of the point of having this workshop. One of the reasons we created is that having a system to go through a big change like that makes it about 100 times less stressful.
Yes.
Much more efficient. And the employee buy-in part, you mentioned your parts guy, is a critical part of your implementation. And there's a certain point where that should be done, and in the driver system. And if you don't do it, you get kind of what you just described, which, and a lot of guys, as they go through the process of implementing change in their shops, you encounter employee resistance. It's common, very common. How did you handle that? And how would you handle it today? So it's a comparison sort of thing.
So at the time, like when we bought the shop, we knew that employee, our parts guy, was a problem. And so I decided that I was going to ignore everything that I'd heard about him, everything that everybody had told me, because I wanted like a fresh perspective. Like that was important to me to give him the benefit of the doubt. And so I kind of just started and I was like, okay, do you have questions on this? Like, this is how this is going to work. You know, guys are going to put in for their parts and you're going to work the parts list. And he's like, oh, but I still have this over here. I'm like, we're not doing that anymore. You know, you may not keep that, like this little like post-it with all these green papers. And I'm like, all of the information is in full bay. And it's not like full bay is it's not sketchy where it's like works sometimes and doesn't work other times. Like,
Right.
I think it's gone out for maybe like an hour in 3 or 4 years. So it's very reliable.
Yeah.
So he's like, well, what if it doesn't work? And I'm like, it will work. He's like, but what if it doesn't? I'm like, then I guess all is lost. Like, it's fine. It's going to be fine. Like all the information's in the computer. You take it, you click on it, you quote it, and you send it back. Like that's the process. That's the workflow. And of course, at that point, like I didn't even really know that because we didn't have a workflow. So it was hard for me to train him what his role was. I just knew that it wasn't that. And this is what I wanted him to do. And so it would have made it easier had I known like where exactly that he plugged into the workflow. But he ended up not working out because he would tell me one thing and then do another.
No, that's not cool.
It wasn't the plan. So he was totally a problem. Everyone else was right. I felt good that I gave him the benefit of the doubt, but also like he didn't work out. So then that's okay. Like it was okay. We moved forward. We have a great parts guy now and it's good. So what I would have done differently is had a plan. Figured out, you know, that I needed a workflow where each employee, like at least in the front office, fit into the workflow. So like, you know, the service advisor takes the information and writes up the ticket, and then it goes to the techs and they do a diagnosis, and it goes to parts and they quote, and then it goes back to the service advisors. At that point, I didn't know enough about our industry, to be quite honest with you, to even know that that was what was happening. I came from a completely different field. And so I just knew like what we had was horrible. And like, it was never the same. Like we never did the same thing twice. Like it was completely bananas as far as like, you know, the service advisors. And then like in full bay, you can completely see every ticket we have written up, the status of it. Well, before it was all on paper. So nobody ever knew what was happening. So I'm like, oh, did we call them? Oh, I don't know. So-and-so was supposed to call them back and then never did. Then it's like 3 days later. And did we follow up on that? Well, nobody knows. Like nobody knows if the work is approved, but we've got parts for it, but it's not approved. And so it was a mess. So knowing what I know now, I would have handled it completely differently. But
yeah, great.
That's where we were.
No, I totally get that. And you know, that a lot of it, what you described is not unique to you and your business by any stretch of the imagination. And that's kind of the part that I want to get across to our audience is that, you know, change is part of doing business, especially if you want to improve your business or you have goals that you want to meet. Most of the time, any kind of a goal that is really desirable and worth achieving is going to involve change in some way. And that's what this workshop is all about. The managing change workshops will guide you through all of the steps necessary to successfully implement change in your business, big or small. And when you get to the end of it, you know that your change was successful. You know that it's going to be permanent, and you're able to rely on your employees to continue doing those actions. Because one of the things that does happen is that you can get somebody to do something once or twice pretty easily. Getting them to do it consistently, that's a whole different thing.
and over a period of time. Like that was
Right.
the biggest thing we ran into, is like I would provide special training. I would write this procedure step by step. I laminated it and I gave it to somebody, and I was like, this is what we're going to do. And it's going to be awesome. And he's like, yeah, it is. And then that was like on a Wednesday. And by the following Monday, he like had gone rogue and was doing what he was doing before, or not even the same thing. And I'm like, remember that laminated thing I gave you that was like steps 1 through 8, A, B, and C? And we're just like, he's like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. I'm like, already? Like how? Like that was literally like 5 days ago. And so it's a very frustrating thing, making changes and then having the changes stick, forever.
Right.
So
So, I'm going to wrap up this conversation. I feel like we could talk for a couple hours on this
oh,
point.
definitely. This is one of like those things where like when Dan and I started with Drive, like I mentioned our first thing, and like the people that had the master shop and they like knew what they were doing. I was like, we're never gonna get there. Like that's hilarious, with where we were. And
Right.
then now it's like we have that, and it's been a lot of work. Like
Yeah.
it just like the tools that Drive gives you make things a lot easier. I know that shop owners don't like to be told what to do, but just listen.
All right. Well, we are just about out of time, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Kris, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this really important subject for shops. And if you're looking at making major changes, which you all should be, then you should do this workshop. It is a lifesaver in terms of it'll make the process of implementing change more efficient and more effective. So we are delivering it live in Monrovia in June. So if you want to take it in person, sign up for that. And next week, we have Kris Probst from Bill's Crestmore Automotive in Denver. And that'll be a good show. So once again, Kris, thank you so much. And everybody have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.